I want to bring our other panelists into the conversation. Lori, we'll start with you. You've been involved in sport at the Olympics, Paralympics, president of USA Volleyball. So what's your view of sport globalization?
Well, I think that, we can't talk about the globalization of sport today without talking about the pandemic. And as Andreas, alluded to, I think the pandemic has in a lot of ways accelerated some of the trends that perhaps were already in place. And, but also it's created some additional barriers or identified, some additional barriers. On the barrier side, I think with the Olympics just having finished up and the Paralympics, just a little bit more than a week away, certainly anybody who watched or consumed content, you can consider yourself a globalist, right? Cheering for your home team, cheering for someone else who had a good result. I think what we saw a lot of the pandemic exposed a lot of the common challenges, that athletes that are involved in global sport have to endure, whether it's training, travel and training, mental health, right? And safeguarding, how to keep athletes safe. All of these issues sort of came to the forefront and were escalated or maybe highlighted a bit more because of the pandemic, but still they were always an issue, right? In global, this is always an issue in global sport, right? I think that what we're seeing now is the interconnectivity of sport, right? Whether you're a track athlete in Europe or a track athlete in Asia, your preparation, your needs, right, for training and your barriers in terms of travel, right? When travel shuts down, like everybody's stuck wherever you happen to be, right? And part of that globalization is you had a lot of athletes training in countries that were not their native countries, and getting either stuck there or having to be really quickly, to pack up and having to be sent back home, wherever home, would be. So I think that what we're seeing now is this sort of flushing to the surface, right, of all these challenges that perhaps existed, already, but now are magnified, by the fact that it really is true that something that happens in one country is going to severely impact, the athletes, the fans, the companies, the sponsors in another, right? With global events being canceled, for example, we were talking earlier about, some of the national or international federations at the time that the pandemic hit, let's say around January, of 2020, this was before the Olympics and the Paralympics were postponed. There was a big question as to, okay, how severe, is this potential pandemic? Will we need to quarantine? What will happen with travel? What will happen with events? And I know from some of the firsthand experience, but also some shared experiences with colleagues, you had cancellation of events almost instantaneously, right? You had teams that were actually en route to an event, to try to qualify for the games, that finding out once they land or just as they're boarding the plane that there's a travel ban in effect because of this pandemic, So I think from a global perspective, right, we have now discovered what is the interconnectivity, right, between not just what happens in our own countries, but what happens in others. Certainly, if you look at the trickle down, analysis of it, it didn't just affect elite athletes and professional athletes and Olympians and Paralympians. It affected the kids in our own communities, right? Whether you're a young football player in Italy and your whole field has been quarantined and you're not able to go outside your house or your apartment, or if you're a Little League player in the United States and Little League World Series is canceled, or all of your events at the neighborhood park, which is closed, have been canceled, right? I know in volleyball, it was very confusing for a lot of club programs because you had some states in the US that were shut down and kids couldn't play, and you had other states that were open and kids could play, but they had nobody to play against, right? Because everyone else was in quarantine. So certainly, the barriers, which were both cultural, and commercial, right? And the effects of which we haven't really been able to fully, examine, just because we're just beginning to reopen, right? We're just beginning to get back to it. But on the plus side, and this is something where I'm really excited to have Fred and Beyond Sport as part of this conversation, because on the plus side, from a global perspective, what has emerged is the importance of the athlete voice, right? And especially in all of the challenges I mentioned before with the travel and training, providing support to each other, whether it was through their national federations, international federations, the focus on mental health, certainly, which is, part of global sport, right? That is a huge part, as we have seen, with the Olympics and whatnot, but also safeguarding. How important is the athlete voice in making sure that, especially during a pandemic, that those who are the most vulnerable are identified, protected, have resources, have an outlet, right? Which normally their outlet would be participating outside or being in sport or whatnot. That could also become a barrier and a real threat, right, to their safety. But the athlete voice certainly emerged, I think, in my opinion, as a key unifier, for global sport. It always has been, but I think now more than ever, the awareness of how important the athlete voice is out there, right? And one example is, I was just reading that Beyond Sport announced their youth advisory board, right? And when before have we ever put emphasis on the kids, right? The kids know what's going on, right? The kids are going to save us, especially the skateboarding kids and everyone else. But I think that that to me has been one of the most significant points. And where are we now, right, with sport globalization? Well, we are now at the point that we're starting to listen, right, to the athletes, and the younger they are, the more information we're able to glean from them as well.